really, when you're talking about civilization, you're really talking about Christianity.
Amen.
It wasn't until Jesus Christ came along that real civilization was possible. And that's what we've had for 2,000 years. People going before us of every color, of every nationality. Right? What's Galatians 3:18 says? It says that you are neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. And throughout all the history of the Christian world, people with a missionary mindset, who accepted the Great Commission as their own personal guidelines, have been out working to make the world a better place and to be able to rescue all their neighbors from the flames by bringing them into the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And all of that is threatened in America by what's called the culture war, and it's an attack on God's perspective of sexuality. And you know, the strategy that they follow is very specific. They do the same thing every place. And let me tell you, the very first thing that they do is called an anti-discrimination policy based on sexual orientation. Right? Understand this. This is probably the most important thing I want to say today, other than reading the Word of God, is that, understand this. The anti-discrimination policy based on sexual orientation is the seed that contains the entire tree of the homosexual agenda with all of its poisonous fruit. Right? It's the acorn. You look at that acorn, you say, that doesn't look like an oak tree. Right? It doesn't look like an oak tree. But the whole oak tree is in that package. And if you let it go into the ground, and you let it take root, and you let it start to grow, you're going to get every bit of it. You're going to get the trunk, you're going to get the branches, you're going to get the leaves, you're going to get the little flowers that grow there in the spring, get all over my lawn. You're going to get all of it, the whole package. And once you let it get in, it's almost impossible to get out in our country. And the only way to be able to deal with these is you got to dig them out and don't let them grow. And unfortunately, here in this state, you now have 3 cities that have adopted anti-discrimination policies based on sexual orientation. Let's change the wording of that. Let's call them sexual orientation regulations. They're SORs, right? And they're oozing SORs, right? SORs. And what we have is a contest between the sexual orientation regulations and the First Amendment of the United States, right? You know that religious freedom is the first principle of the Bill of Rights? Religious freedom is the first principle of the Bill of Rights. And the second principle of the Bill of Rights is freedom of speech. And you know what's happening in this country and all around the world? Is that, in this country, because dealing with the First Amendment, that the First Amendment is being trumped by sexual orientation regulations. I'm telling you, I'm an attorney. I studied constitutional law. I hold a certificate in international human rights. I've studied human rights more than most of the other guys on the other side do. And I can tell you that in 4,000 years of written legal foundations, jurisprudence, there's never been in the history of the world protection for sexual perversion. Ever until the last couple of decades. But there has always been protection for religious freedom. At different times there wasn't. But from the beginning of the 4,000 years, intermittently, most of the time, there's protection for religious freedom and protection for family values. And so here, the foundation stone of modern human rights law is the document called the Magna Carta. How many people have heard of the Magna Carta? The Magna Carta, in 1215, the nobles forced the king to give concessions to the people. Right? You know what the first principle of the Magna Carta is? The first principle of the Magna Carta is the English church must be free. So the same thing. The Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, the first principle is religious freedom. And you know what? That lasted, that was 1215. Almost 800 years went by and the Magna Carta stood firm until the Kingdom of Britain adopted sexual orientation regulations, and the sexual orientation regulations are now deemed to trump the Magna Carta.
Wow.
Right? The church is being forced. The church is no longer free. It's subject to government control about the anti-discrimination policies based on sexual orientation, homosexuality. And in this country, the same thing. I represented the most significant case that I ever had when I was working as a lawyer in Southern California. I had a private practice, and I also had a public interest law firm called the Pro Family Law Center. My most significant case of that entire time, I represented 2 African-American Christian women were employees of the city of Oakland, California. And the gays had come forward and they formed a Gay and Lesbian Employee Association. And the city had given them everything they wanted. They let them use the city email system, etc., etc. They would send out invitations to Gay Pride Day and all that. And my clients were they said, you know, we should have representation too. So they asked me to help them. We formed the Good News Employee Association. And we created a theme for the association that wasn't going to be offensive to anybody. It was just going to express our opinion. And the phrase was the natural family, family values, and marriage. The natural family, marriage, and family values. That was the phrase, right? All of this is just simply expressing the Christian viewpoint in secular terms, right? And they went and they posted that up on the billboard. They posted an invitation for people to join the Good News Employee Association. And the head of the agency came along and ripped it down, sent a memo to all the employees saying that they were never going to accept this kind of homophobic trash being posted on the bulletin board, and that anybody that dared to do it in the future was subject to punishment, including termination. Alright? So war is declared. So we filed a lawsuit in federal court based on the free speech rights of my clients to be able to express Christian viewpoint in the workplace. Fundamental First Amendment right? Right? Everybody assumes that of course you get to do that. Well, you know what? We got Justice Vaughn Walker. Vaughn Walker is the guy that struck down Proposition 8 several years later, and then after he did that, he retired and came out of the closet as a homosexual. You're not supposed to rule on the case. You're not supposed to rule on a case when you have a personal interest in it, but nobody called him on it. And he ruled against my clients. He said that their right to present a pro-family Christian viewpoint in the workplace was vanishingly small, right? In other words, it had almost no significance at all. And so we appealed it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the most overturned circuit in the whole country. And I had the privilege. You know, most lawyers would just give their teeth to have a chance to do something like this. But I had the privilege, as just an attorney, had only been in practice for a few years, and only ever really did just a few cases in the common law. And I had the privilege of arguing a free speech case before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel that was held in special session at Stanford University. Amazing, wonderful thing, except from the get-go, all 3 judges are obviously against us. And they affirmed Judge Walker's ruling, and my clients were deemed to not have constitutional rights of free speech in their workplace. Wow. This was in 2003. Right? So you can see how fast things are going right now. And this is not the only case. All over America, that when there's a contest between the First Amendment and these sexual orientation regulations, the First Amendment is losing. But it's only losing because people don't understand the issue. Let me just cut right to the chase. That here in this city, you have a sexual orientation policy based on an anti-discrimination policy, a sexual orientation regulation that has gotten into the soil here. Right? There's an effort that's underway to repeal it. And if you can't repeal it, then I've got a backup to that called the First Amendment Supremacy Clause. This is what I wrote, that we're now going all over the country and talking about. It basically just says this: under no circumstance shall sexual orientation regulations supersede the First Amendment rights of individuals, churches, and religious organizations to freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion. Simple, straightforward. And it basically will then stop them from being, because this is what they do. They come forward saying that they want the policy to protect themselves from discrimination so they won't be fired from their job or they will denied housing. It's not happening. Nobody is denying them jobs or denying them housing. It's a lie. But that's how they gain the sympathy of people, and so that they say, okay, we'll put that in. Once they put that in, then you find out that they don't want it as a shield of protection. They want it as a sword of attack.
That's right.
And then what comes out almost immediately afterwards is they'll start going through the yellow pages looking for the businesses with the Christian symbols on them. And then they go in and they'll say to the bakery, look, I want you to make a wedding cake for my homosexual marriage. And the Christian owner of the bake shop says, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. Go someplace else. And then boom, comes the lawsuit. They've done this over and over and over again all over the United States. And what they want to do is they want to make an example out of you so that everyone else won't dare to oppose them. Right? And then they move to the next level. Because that's the level where between acceptance and celebration. They want to push it all the way until they actually have all the power. And then they're going to punish everybody that disagrees with them. That's already happening. I'm being sued right now for crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is a category of crimes that was created by the Allies to prosecute the Nazis. And I went to Uganda. I'm known by my enemies as the father of the Ugandan pro-family movement, because I went there and helped them organize a movement to resist the homosexualization of their culture. Now, Uganda is a country. It's the only country in the world that has a national holiday that celebrates the rejection of homosexuality. The only country in the world that has that. It's June 3rd when they celebrate it's called Martyrs' Day. And it's the anniversary of the day when 22 Catholic boys and young men refused to submit to sodomy by the king. King Mwanga had the power to be able to pick any of the boys in his community to come and be one of his pages, and then he would mess with them. He would indulge in sodomy with them. And Catholicism had come in the meantime, and these young men said, "We're not going to let you do this to us." Mwanga was infuriated. See, you get the picture of the guys clawing at the door in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? This is the spirit. He's infuriated. How dare you resist me, right? He has these young men and boys torturously bound, as tight as the ropes can take them, cutting into their flesh. They're marched 37 miles. And then at the end of the march, they're standing there and they're given a chance to submit. And they say no, and then one by one they're thrown alive on the bonfire and burned to death. Right? That's Martyrs' Day. That's what happened in Uganda. So in recent years, see what happened in Uganda is after Idi Amin, the Christians took control of the government. There's been a revival in Uganda for quite a long time, and Uganda was able to turn the tide on AIDS unlike any other country in Africa. They went from having the highest level of AIDS to the lowest level of AIDS in Africa using Christian principles. Abstinence until marriage, fidelity in marriage, etc. Right? And all of a sudden, the whole world is looking at this country, this poor little country, third world country, that's managed to do what nobody else could do with condoms and the sexual revolution. And that really got in the way of the globalists. They use the sexual revolution to bring countries under their control. Because it never works. It can't work. Right? It just simply disintegrates the culture when you bring in sexual perversion. It breaks down marriages, breaks down families, and that makes them easier to control. And so they had to do something about Uganda. And so people like George Soros and some of these other people began then trying to infiltrate Uganda to change their culture and introduce the sexual revolution. The Ugandans, see this, homosexuality, abortion, pornography were all illegal in Uganda, even at that point, but that didn't stop anybody. They came in, and first they started using pornography, just like they did in the United States, to soften everybody up, and that's what started. So they had a conference in 2002, a national conference against pornography and obscenity, and just by the grace of God, I was the person chosen as the substitute speaker when the first speaker couldn't do it. The guy who was organizing it there, his father had been a missionary to Mongolia, and he'd come to one of my speeches in Southern California, and his dad was telling his dad, "Hey, what are we going to do?" And Pastor Willis says, "I know just the guy." So I ended up as the keynote speaker of that conference, the top 400 people of the whole society, Supreme Court justices, members of Parliament, ministers of the government, and then I told them exactly what's going on. That launched the pro-family movement, and then they put in some things that didn't quite do the job. So in 2009, they asked me to come back again. They were going to strengthen their law. Unfortunately, they went too far. After I left, they came out with the so-called Kill the Gays bill. It had capital punishment for homosexuality. Well, it's mostly based on pedophilia, but it included second offenses on homosexuality. It was like, I did not advocate that, right? But they accused me of doing that, and now a group of homosexual activists from Uganda, using a Marxist law firm based in New York, filed a lawsuit in federal court against me under the Alien Tort Statute for crimes against humanity, saying I'm responsible for things that happen to homosexuals in that country. But what happened to homosexuals in that country? Almost nothing. A couple of their meetings got broken up, etc., etc. One guy was murdered. Right? A guy named David Cato was murdered in early 2011. The entire international media jumped on it and said, this is an example of what happens when you let people preach against homosexuality. Homosexuals get killed. Right? 5 days later, now, and everybody's pointing the finger at me. Right? This is the mastermind. He's the one responsible. Right? I was like, oh no, I'm not going to get assassinated here. And but then 5 days later, the guy that actually did it came forward. The police caught him, and he confessed. It was a male prostitute who had been bailed out of jail by Cato himself to be his live-in lover and houseboy. And when the guy wouldn't pay him as promised, he bashed his brains in with a hammer. That's the reality. So, and the guy's now serving 30 years in a Ugandan prison. He was convicted and is in jail. You know what? When they filed a lawsuit against me, they left all that out. They only put in the part about David Cato being murdered, and they left the implication that it was done by some homophobic bigot because of what Scott Lively said. Right? These guys are liars. They're manipulators. Anyway, this is what's going on, and I want you to know that you cannot sit idly by and watch your society disintegrate. You can't do it. Only the Christians are left to stand up for this, and this is your community, and I urge you to step forward, get involved in the process of getting the rest of the signatures to get that on the ballot, to repeal that sexual orientation policy, and brace yourselves and brace the rest of the Christians for what's coming. There is a wave of attack on the church like you've never seen before that's going to be based in gay theology when everybody is going to be challenged. I guarantee you this, every single Christian is going to have to take a stand on homosexuality. You're going to have to take a stand on it. You know, and it's not a salvation issue. What you say or believe about homosexuality doesn't affect whether or not you get to go to heaven. But it does affect whether you're going to be weakened or strengthened by the conflict. Right? Jeremiah, and I'm going to close with this, Jeremiah at a time that's very similar to our time. Jeremiah was a prophet when Judah was under siege by Nebuchadnezzar and Jerusalem was going to fall in a fairly short period of time. God had told the people, you're under judgment. I'm not listening to your prayers about restoration anymore. Right? And Jeremiah comes forward and he's dealing with the remnant of the Christian believers. And he says to them, if you can't walk with the footmen, how are you going to run with the horses? And if you fall down in the land of peace, what will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? Right? That's what I'm asking you, friends. Right? If you aren't able to stand on this, see, he was faithful in little, will be faithful in much. You're going to be challenged on this. You're going to be pressed on this. They're going to accuse you of being a hater. They're going to demand that you change their theology and that you start saying homosexuality is good and normal and God blesses it, right? And you're going to be tempted to do that because the pressure is going to be intense. But I tell you this, if you can't stand when the only punishment that you're going to get for it is just somebody laughing at you or maybe you lose a job or something like that. If you can't walk with the footmen, how are you going to run with the horses? And if you're going to give in on something like that, what's going to happen not too far down the road when they come with the mark of the beast? If you haven't learned to be able to stand up for the truth of God, right? In the book of Revelation, it says, how did the Christians prevail? They prevailed by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives unto death. Right? It's coming, folks. I don't think we've got much time left on this world. Jesus said that in the end times it was going to be like the days of Noah. And you know what? There has never been a time in the history of the world since the flood when homosexual marriage was being celebrated. Right? I'm telling you, God gave us a very specific flashing beacon of when are things going to come down? When you see them start doing homosexual marriages, then you know that you're in the land just before it starts to rain. Right? And if you're not on that ark, you're going to drown. And that's where we are right now. So get yourself right with God. You do everything you can to bring the rest of the remnant together, to coalesce together. And you stand for the truth of God and you cling to Him with everything that you have. Like Cassie Bernal. Remember Cassie Bernal, the girl in Columbine High School? Cassie Bernal had been a Satanist. And she had run in the crowd with those two young men that committed that massacre. And when they were going through that school and they looked across the cafeteria and they saw Cassie Bernal, they went right to her. And they knew she had accepted Jesus Christ as her Savior. But she had been one of them. She had been with the devil. And they put the gun to her head and they said, "Do you renounce Jesus Christ?" And she said no, and they shot her in the head. You have to be ready for that. We're entering into the time when the sword is likely to end up on the neck of people sitting right in this room. And you're going to have to decide what you're going to do. And here's an opportunity to show the Lord that you can be faithful in little. Right? And that's to stand up for His truth on this issue. Because it's the test issue. It's the test issue. The test issue for Christians in the mid-1800s was where they stood on slavery. Right? That was the test issue. The test issue for Christians in Germany in the 1930s was where they stood on the treatment of the Jews. And the test issue for today is, where do you stand on the truth of the Bible dealing with the fundamental issue of marriage and sexuality? Amen? Amen. Thank you so much for your patience. God bless you all. And I hope to see in the news that this issue has gone down.